Hi, I'm Pete Gregory, and I'm moderator. I know nothing about blacksmithing. I'm going to turn it. I'm going to probably start with Ben since Marty's out for a second. And Ben Deschatel is with the West Baton Rouge Museum, and he's a blacksmith.
Yeah.
And so and here's Marty.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
We were betting on whether you'd get caught in a conversation.
I
Yeah,
did,
yeah.
actually. I got out there and sorry, somebody goes, "What are y'all doing?" I said, "I'm getting the phone."
Yeah. So anyway, they started on us. So I think you're live.
Am I? Can y'all hear me?
Okay.
And so I'm just going to start with Ben and let him tell you all something about what they're doing, and then we can have a round of Q&A, and you can ask questions, and they can tell you things about what they do. We've had blacksmiths at this festival for at least 4 years now, and it's always a big hit with people. And like they say, people visit them passing by. They don't stay out there very long. And Ben, you want to tell us about what you guys are up to?
Yeah. So, like I said, I work at the West Baton Rouge Museum, and I blacksmith and I demonstrate blacksmithing, and I teach classes over there. But they also have hired me to help manage their website and keep some things updated technologically, as well as just doing general repairs around the museum. Museum employees usually wear a lot of hats. So, but for me, the reason that I was really drawn to blacksmithing is so much of what I was doing when I was younger was all online or on the computer. So there's still ways to make things doing that. You know, you might write a program or whatever, but you don't hold anything when you do that. It's not tangible. Whereas when you forge something out, you really feel what you're doing with that metal. You know, you're getting it hot and you're hitting it with the hammer to shape it. And it kind of works like a hard clay when it's hot. So you kind of squish it almost like you would Play-Doh, and you can make whatever shapes you want. And that's what really drew me to blacksmithing and kept me doing it, was the fact that I was making something so tangible. Yeah, c'est ça.
So, just Marty Young, I'm the director of the LSUS Pioneer Heritage Center in Shreveport, Louisiana. We're on the campus of Louisiana State University. I've been blacksmithing for about 15 years. Much like Ben says, I'm also a museum employee, wear a lot of hats, but I started doing living history things probably 30 years ago. And I say things, I mean demonstration. I'm a firm believer in teaching through demonstration. So I started out doing military impersonations, and then it was into cooking demonstrations, and then into just pioneer crafts. And eventually I got into doing the blacksmithing because at the school, they were just coming down to the point saying, don't do this, don't do this. We're kind of in a sue happy world. And so, you know, it's kind of like we don't want a kid to lose a finger making shingles. We don't want a kid eating a biscuit and getting a bellyache. So the only thing, they gave me the no's. They gave me the list of no's, and all of a sudden it was, well, blacksmithing's not on there, and we had a blacksmith shop. So I decided to step off and started blacksmithing. And much like Ben says, I think it's a much greater teaching tool when they can see progression from A to B, B to C, C to D, and then there's the finished product. When we demo what we're doing today, a lot of simple items. I mean, we may have some things on the display table that takes way longer than what we would be displaying or demonstrating today. But, you know, demonstrating, you at least get the idea. So when we demonstrate, it's a lot, like today, it'll be a lot of nails, a lot of steak flipper tools. There's just a lot of simple, small, I'll probably make some miniature spoons. We cranked out this morning, first thing. We both made egg lifters for the
Pasanki
egg demonstrators. They forgot to bring a spoon to bring their eggs out this morning, so we made egg dippers for them to bring their eggs out of the dye today. So
to add a little bit of what Marty was talking about, teaching history, there was a blacksmith in South Carolina that I went and saw a couple of his demonstrations, and he would always make this joke. He would say, history should be provocative. So that's why I have a little cleavage. I mean, he's just a burly old guy, you know. But really what he's saying, though, is if you don't emit some emotion when you're teaching history, so if you're not showing this huge fire, or like I'll make hog head cheese sometimes, you know, you lift that hog head out of a pot and everybody goes, ooh, you know. they're much more likely to receive what you're telling them and actually learn what you're saying if you can really get them involved and excited about what it is you're doing. Yeah.
So what do you think about online blacksmithing?
I like how easy the information is now available.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, if someone wants to find the information about how to blacksmith, they can do it. We get a lot of people that come up and they'll say, oh, I want to start doing this, but they haven't really done any legwork on their own or really looked into it.
So I teach as well, like Ben does. I teach blacksmithing. I have a love-hate relationship with internet blacksmithing.
Yeah.
Because you'll have somebody who has watched hundreds of hours of video blacksmithing, and then they show up where you're at demonstrating, or maybe if you're teaching a class, they sign up, and all of a sudden they know more than you do. And I'm like, well, you know what? Watching it's one thing, but when you put a hammer in their hand and you say, okay, we'll make a point. You know, and they don't realize that the part they may not tell you on that video is you tip that up 45 degrees to start drawing that point on it. Or they're just automatically using the round face of the hammer instead of the flat face of the hammer. I mean, there's a lot of kind of things that don't get said in some of those videos. And it's the same when you're reading a book. I mean, if you're looking at a diagram, there's so many diagrams that show them drawing a point, you know, and you can read it and they go, okay, well, they're referring to a rounding hammer, but the diagram is a flat face ball peen hammer. Yeah. So, you know, so it's a love hate. I think when you can sit there and Ben, you can, when you teach, there are things that you kind of almost do automatically, and you have to kind of re-trigger your brain to say, do this, do this, do this, because if you don't, I mean, you know, I can make a point without thinking about it, you know, and I just lay it on there and start. I have to sit there and go, oh, remember, tip this up and do this and rotate it 90 degrees, and you know, so it's a love-hate relationship with but as Ben says, I love to be able to sit there and say, see a picture of something online and go, I wonder, and then go to YouTube or whatever and go, you know, whatever it may be, you know, cross with a diamond hole in the middle, you know, and all of a sudden, bam, there's a video. Yeah. I mean, I can pick and choose. Then I can kind of pick and choose information from there to see how it wants to, you know, how I want to do it.
Yeah. The worst is when they show up and they think they know how to do it.
Yeah. I had that relationship with an axe and
making one or using one.
Yeah, well, using one. And trying to show people how to use one. They can watch it on YouTube. You know, a broad axe looks real nice on YouTube. To pick it up and what it does to your shoulder and your back.
Correct.
That's not on YouTube, and so you miss part of the experience that we can't do. We all have that problem with sort of ambivalent about teaching online. I think everybody would teach something face to face. They wouldn't teach online or couldn't.
And you know, and you don't get nearly as hot doing online blacksmithing.
Yeah, you're right about that. Yeah.
That's always the good one. They get out there, you know, you teach a class, and they go, "It's hot."
Yeah.
Like,
really?
Really? Yeah.
I know that.
It tends to be.
Yeah. I'm an archaeologist, so it's a shovel that I know best, and a
That's
trowel
right.
I know best. And they can watch, but doing it's, like you say, quite another thing. So you're talking about hammers. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of hammers?
Sure. So I carry generally 3 primary style hammers in my box. I have just a regular old straight peen hammer, which is going to be a flat face with a taper on the back. And that's really good for spreading material. You can use that peen. So if you have a piece of material like this and you hammer, you want to spread it out into a fan or even start to form a spoon or a ladle, you use the cross peen part, and you start in the middle and you work it, and that'll start to push it, and then you just work it kind of in a fan diameter. So you'll hammer hit here, 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 and that pushes the material out in that direction, in those directions. Then I have a rounding hammer. And a rounding hammer is a hammer that has a flat face on one side and a round face on the other side. And that is used in drawing out material. So you have your square stock and you use your round face, so you're hitting a round surface onto the flat surface, and it puts a divot in it. and then you move over a little bit, or pull it to you, push it from you, whichever the material you needs to go. Put another divot, another divot, another divot, and you come back and you hammer the high spots out. Then you rotate it and do the same thing. You can do it on the face of the anvil, which is the top, or you can use the horn of the anvil to do that, and that makes the material so you're hitting a curved surface on a curved surface, and it draws it out faster. And always a good old trusty ball peen hammer. Yeah. That's usually the 3 I carry.
I have a background in mathematics, so I can relate a lot of what we're doing in blacksmithing to what he's saying to some terms. But basically what he's saying is when you decrease the surface area that you're striking, you increase the force, because force is based off surface area squared. So by having these 2 rounded hammers, you're swinging the hammer the same amount, but it hits harder because you've decreased the surface area.
Yeah.
Marty, how about the cow poo theory?
Okay.
Oh yeah, well, the cow
theory?
poo theory. If you hold up that hammer he's got there, that's the cross peen, right? See, the peen is the straight side on the back. You ever whack the cow patty with a stick? It splits in 2, and when you hit it with the shovel, it splits in all the directions. Which I'm glad more people teach with that than I do, that analogy. But yeah, so the flat face is the shovel hitting the cow patty, and that makes it spread out in all the directions.
Yeah.
So I mean that's what blacksmithing is. One of the campus police officers stopped by. He did his Eagle Scout project with me years ago, and so we were chatting outside, and he goes, "What are you going to be doing and making today?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to be making a whole lot of mistakes." And he goes, "Well, I didn't think blacksmithing was making mistakes because I thought it was the constant correction of mistakes." And I was like, that's a great way to put it. So, so you're just moving the material. I mean, it's all still there. I mean, you picture, we talked about making a point. I know we're talking about hammers, but
what's the point, Marty?
That's the point. It's a moot point, so it doesn't really matter. So your hammer is what you're using to, in lieu of using your hands to move the material, your hammer is what you're using it to move. So I mean, your hammer face and where to hit it and which way you want to push it. So I mean, even it's not always a straight blow. It's sometimes you got your material halfway off your anvil, halfway on your anvil, completely on your anvil. So wherever your hammer face is hitting, that's what that metal is going to do. So I mean, if you're going to curve it, you're going to flatten it, you're going to bend it, you can hammer it, keep hammering in one spot, and you can make it turn to the left, you can make it turn to the right. I mean, you can make it do what you want it to, But the point is to get it from wherever you start to the finish.
And the hammers are definitely a source of pride to get back to your original point. Mm-hmm. If I'll hand forge my own hammers, or I might pay another blacksmith to forge one for me, but it's nice to have one that I know exactly where it came from, what material it was made out of. And a lot of times you can reuse old materials to make it. So I've got some that are made out of some cylinders out of like a hydraulic shaft, and that worked real well.
That's nice, yeah. And there are different kinds of anvils too, right?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
There's different styles, different patterns of anvils as well.
Yeah.
We've only got 45 minutes, huh? 'Cause we could go on for a while.
Yeah, right. Going for a while.
Which ones are good and which ones aren't.
Yeah.
So anvils variety. I mean, English pattern is pretty much the standard that most people use. There's also a German style, and
I like the French.
Yeah. So what's the difference?
So if you take a few minutes and you do come outside to see it, both Ben and I are both using English style anvils today.
Yeah.
So an English style anvil has just a horn, a cutting surface, a face, the body, and the foot. I mean, and of course, Pritchard hole and a Hardy hole. That's for holding tools. And that's just a pretty standard anvil. You watch 99% of anything you see on TV or anywhere, that's all English pattern anvils they have. Then you have the German styles, which have points on both ends.
And they're flat all the way across.
Flat all the way across, no cutting surface, no anything on it. So the entire face is used for working metal. And so they're tapered differently at both ends. And so, I mean, everywhere you want to, anywhere on the anvil, you can do bends and draws and whatever else. And since you like French, I'll let you
the French has a square horn and a round horn, and they're both set down a little lower than the working face of the anvil.
Yeah.
And then there's cathedral anvils.
Well, those are pretty too.
Yeah, we've got a lot of artifacts from Presidio Los Adais, which is a Spanish fort west of town here. Mm-hmm. Would you guys come look at them sometime?
Yeah.
And tell me what you can tell me about
Tell you if they still work or not.
Yeah. When we get them, they're rust. It's our relationship to them is either leave them in the rust or take them out of the rust. But But they had a blacksmith and they had a forge, and they made a lot of iron. I've wondered about the differences in the anvils. We've never found an anvil out here.
And the steel used to be so much harder to come by that the anvils weren't as big. Like I don't know about in Shreveport, but what size anvils they might have been using around there. But
Well, of course, they would have been imported. They would have all been coming out of New Orleans early on. So we're talking 1830s or so. That would have been, they would have been bringing it into New Orleans. You also have those colonial style anvils, which doesn't have a horn on them at all.
yeah,
It's
kind of
just
like a sawyer's
It
anvil.
just comes up, yep, and just a flat top on it. So they, again, it was easier to shape, and then it was also it just took less material to make.
Yeah,
them.
I have seen people take a piece of railroad,
Yeah. We call those ASOs.
yeah, and just chop it off and
Yeah.
make that colonial anvil.
Yeah, anvil-shaped objects.
Right, yeah. It's kind of neat.
Might talk about the kind of steels.
Okay, so early on, I mean, it would have been, how far back do you want to go? I mean, early history of blacksmithing, we throw dates, Dr. Gregory, and you can, maybe you might know, but I know when you look up, if you were to type history of blacksmithing, again, we'll go back to the internet, most sites will say 5500 BCE with the Hittites because they found smelted iron on dig sites there. So they say that is the early parts of blacksmithing. Okay. I think there was probably some stuff being done before then because, I mean, you could find copper ore and stuff, and you could surface find some of that stuff, even surface find iron ore. So I think there was probably some done prior to that. But
What was the time frame?
5500 BCE.
Okay.
But earliest material would have been what we refer to as wrought iron.
Yeah.
And that's just where they find iron ore. They pulled it into a big smelting furnace and they just melt the whole thing down and make what's called a bloom. And then from that bloom, they knock off all the junk, and then there's a chunk of iron in there, and then they refine that to a usable piece of material. And then of course, as anything else, as it evolved, they started realizing if we add carbon to this or we add this to this, the metals would get stronger, and that's when you start getting into making rough, crude steels, and then, scientifically go from there. You're the math man. I don't know if you know anything about the way they make,
Like modern steels.
I mean, that's just mixes and,
Yeah. So like a carbon steel kitchen knife would be about 0.8% carbon, so not a lot of carbon at all. And then the steel we use is about 0.1 to 0.2% carbon. It's not
I was
much.
thinking more like pioneer days.
that would have been just wrought iron, and it would be just rough, refined.
They might have very small amounts of hardenable steel, which is when we talk about steel, we talk about something you can harden. And they would reserve that just for their cutting edges, or maybe the face of a hammer. But they certainly wouldn't make a whole tool out of that just because it was so much harder to get.
Like today, if you were going to make a punch, I mean, you just take a piece of spring.
Yeah, like a shock off a car.
Or whatever, and you just make the entire punch that way. Whereas if you make a tomahawk, you can make that out of the piece of steel, the entire thing, and do a wrapped eye, and the whole body of is a piece of workable steel. Whereas back when the pioneers were doing it, like Ben said, they would have small pieces of hardenable steel. They would have made the entire body out of wrought iron and then forge welded that steel bit on the end. And that would be the cutting edge, where the rest of the body would be just what they would refer to as wrought iron. And today they make something called soft iron, which is kind of the closest thing you can get to wrought iron.
Talking about like some 1018.
Yeah, that kind of, and then of course, if you want wrought iron, you have to wait till they take down a bridge like the Jimmy Davis Bridge and get all the bolts out of it. A lot of those are wrought iron from back in the day.
That's a big misused word in metalworking is wrought iron. So people will refer to all the balconies in New Orleans as wrought iron balconies, but really they're cast, which means they took the metal and melted it or made it liquid and then poured it into a mold, kind of like you would do with a Jell-O mold, and then just let it set. Whereas wrought iron is, like he's talking about, they took this metal and drew it out in the bar and folded it and made these big strips. And the wrought iron has some natural silica impurities in it that actually prevent it from rusting and make it self-fluxing which is really nice whenever you're trying to forge weld. So that's why they have all these old anchors that they pull out of salt water and they're still intact, is because of that silica impurity.
Yeah. The preservation of iron varies with the environment so much. Down here, most of it's, if it's very, very old iron, it's in pretty bad shape. But 6 feet away in the same site we dig, we might find a piece of iron that's in perfect shape. And nails, if the beam burns around the nail stays. And if the nails are just thrown out in the dirt, then they eventually just erode away. And and the kind of iron, like you say, the kind of iron determines on whether it preserves well or not. You know, so the cemeteries here have iron crosses, very old grave markers here. They're all wrought iron, and they last a long time without rusting. And people sometimes ask me, why didn't they rust away? Well, they're wrought iron.
Yeah.
You know, they're very hard.
Which we won't be demonstrating any forge welding today.
No.
We generally don't forge weld at demos because it splatters.
And it's right at the height of a child's eyes.
So, since we mentioned forge welding, I just throw that out there. Anything? Is there anything? Do y'all have anybody here have any questions? I mean, we've
You, on the wagon wheel, the iron rim around the wagon wheel, how would you find enough iron to produce that?
So it was those were 90. That's why so many of those still exist, because most of those are wrought iron. Number one, and they would, just like Ben said, they would make the bloom, and then they would draw that out and fold it back on itself, and it pushes the impurities, most of the impurities out to get the wrought iron, and you just make a strip that long. And since it's so easy to forge weld, let's just say you needed 6 foot to make a wheel. Well, if you had 2 3.5 foot pieces, you could lay them, you could lap them, and then forge weld it, and then bring it around, and then they would lap it again, and forge weld it to make it onto the. And of course, they're heated when they're put on the wheel. If you know how wheelwrights work, they're heated when they put them on the wooden part, and then they quench it really quickly, and it shrinks to pull it together. I can throw out, y'all know that's why they're called tires, right? Why your tires on your car and all that. That's what you call the outside band on a wagon wheel. That's the tire, because it ties the entire wheel together. Just throw that little bit of tidbit out there.
They the oldest forms of making wrought iron, building this little crucible like he's talking about, you could maybe get a 25-pound bloom out of it, which by the time you knocked all the silica and everything out of there, maybe 10.5 pounds. Like it's not.
It's kind of like making charcoal.
Kind of weight.
You get half.
Yeah, you get about half what
weight.
you put in. They eventually started melting it and putting it in a big, almost vat, and they would take, kind of like almost dipping sand, they would take a rod of steel and dip it in there and pick it up, and that was puddle iron. And it kind of still made something similar to wrought iron with these layers, because you kept adding these layers onto it. And with that, it was as heavy as a man could pick up out of there on the end of like a 8-foot rod, so it was about 50 pounds. And then you just take those and keep welding it together and eventually make a 1-ton anchor if you really wanted to.
So it was just, back to your question, it was just links of, and then just keep forge welding it together until you got the, and of course if you had the machine, like if you had a water wheel driven hammer or anything like that, you could draw out a 6 or 8 foot piece. You could keep it, if you have, because I mean, you consider, like Ben was talking about reducing the surface, and I'm a historian, he's the math guy. So, if you start out with a block that's like this and 2 inches by 2 inches, and you can draw that out. I mean, you can make it as long as this table.
Yeah. So for the math of it is, if you cut it in half on one side and cut it in half on the other, you quadruple the length. So if you got a 1-foot bar and you draw it out halfway on each dimension, now you got a 4-foot bar.
See, math.
Yeah.
Wait, I'll just throw this out there just because we're talking about the math. Richard, my friend Richard Miles right here, Richard and I blacksmith together. We took a class with Mark Asbury, who's pretty renowned. See, you saw Ben shake his head. We took a class with him, and I asked Mark in the class, I said, hey, Mark, and he his head works mathematics the entire time he blacksmiths. That's all. I mean, it does. And I'd been told that, and I was like, surely not. But I made the comment to him. I said, hey, are we going to learn how to do some forge welding in your class? And he gets this puzzled look on his face. And then he goes, oh, you mean, are we going to learn to pass atoms across the plane? And so, so back to, drawing our forge welding, I mean, that's what you're doing. But that's a whole other thing. But again, those math brains think differently in blacksmithing than we historian brains.
If y'all are wondering if blacksmiths all make the same terrible jokes constantly, it's true. We all do.
It's a small pool of them.
See, what are all the...
Didn't Mark demonstrate at the conference down where
Yeah, it's going to be Gulf Coast Blacksmith Association and LAMA, the Louisiana Metalsmith Association.
I think Mark said.
Yeah,
Yep.
they're putting on a second conference this year, and he'll be there.
There's a guy down in Lafayette, Patrick, that's been making blooms.
Yeah.
He makes several a year. Really nice. He gets about 25 pounds
Yeah.
of iron. It takes pretty much all day to do it.
Yeah, I did.
Iron ore and, everything.
I did one of those with Patrick, with Llama as well, and it was fun, but it was rough. And it was about 8 hours of, like you said, we'd put a charge of iron ore in there, and then a charge of charcoal, and slowly let it burn down in this cupola, essentially. And then at the very end of it, after 8 hours of doing this, and you're exhausted, everybody grabs a sledgehammer, and they pull that bloom out, and it's real soft and spongy. And you got to tap it together and just slowly get it to make a solid mass. But now you're exhausted, but you're excited because you got this huge thing that it's hot. I mean, you couldn't, from here to there, your hands are burning trying to touch it. So we're trying to just swing a sledgehammer at it. Way hotter than anything I've done before. But definitely a lot of fun.
Where is this conference? Where?
It's, if you look up the Louisiana Metalsmiths Association or Gulf Coast Blacksmith Association, it's later this year, maybe in October or November. Somewhere around there. Yeah. We're real bad at dates too, those blacksmiths, but.
I took one of those blooms that Patrick gave me and gave it to my Patrick in the North Arkansas. He's probably the best welder, forge welder in the country.
I told you.
I was going to make something out of it.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see what he does,
Yeah, I'm excited to see that. What is the local blacksmithing group up here?
Well, the Red River Smiths is our group that we have in Shreveport. I don't know if they have one here in Natchitoches. I don't know if there's a group here or not.
Okay.
Dr. Gregory, would you like us to maybe talk about fuels that we burn?
Yeah, I was going to ask that.
Okay, well, good. I didn't want to get ahead of you, but I was just...
No, I'm behind you, but go ahead.
So you've heard Ben and I both, we've both, said, when you a coal fire or charcoal fire. So there's really, currently there's, at least I say 4 basic fuels you'll use. Now, if you go back to the first fuels that they would have used, it would have been charcoal. And that would have been just hardwoods, or it could even be dried out cow chips or whatever they could turn into a chunk of charcoal. That's what got used.
Yeah, any lump of carbon that they could burn.
Any lump of carbon they could find. And then, of course, it would later evolve into, that was become someone's job. And it's called a collier, and that's all they did was they made charcoal.
Yeah,
It's huge, big berms, and they just, thousands of footboard feet of lumber piled into it. They would then cover it, leave a few vent holes, light it, and then once it started smoking, where they recognized the smoke goes from that dark white to a see-through kind of a blue color. You snuff all the holes, and then it just slowly turns the wood in there into charcoal, and that's what they would use. Then, of course, deep mine coal would come along, so they used peat too. I forgot about you. We throw peat in there, but peat and lignite, because that was pretty shallow. And then they went into bituminous and anthracitic coal. Here, after the American Civil War, that's when deep mine coal, bituminous coal, really started to kind of come into fashion, because they could ship it via train all over the country if they needed to, or by river system. And then, of course, there's coke, which is coal that has already been run through a furnace at least once or twice to burn out all the impurities, the sulfur, the dirt, the whatever else is in there to get the pure carbon than the coal actually is. And then, of course, there's gas. I missed anything, Ben?
I don't think so.
Okay, I'm making sure. So gas forges have become really super popular over the last 15 years or so.
The newest technology is electricity. They take a coil induction forges, and those are very interesting to see because they'll take a 1-inch square bar and get it hot in 30 seconds, and there's no heat coming off of it or anything.
Yeah, but it's
and it's concentrated.
It's concentrated heat. So if you're like you need to drift an eye through a piece, it's great because you can stick it through that coil and it heats up inch and a half of it right there, and you can drive your punch through it or when you come out. So
yeah, not as fun for demonstrating though. If I'm going to demonstrate, I want to have a fire with smoke and big flames to draw people's attention.
Break up a party real quick.
Well, that too.
One of the fun things we've discovered at Los Dice is that they forged the cannonballs. You know, so we wondered for years how they did that, but we finally cleaned one down to the surface, and you can still see the hammer marks. And
so they're making solid shot. They weren't casting them.
No, they weren't casting.
Wow.
They're hammering them round. And
roundish.
Round. They're pretty round. They're amazingly round. And so I always thought they were cast, but no, they're hammered out.
Oh, well, that's pretty impressive.
These are little 6-pound balls, solid balls. And
you said there's hammer marks on it. So
yeah, you can still see the hammer marks.
So y'all don't think it was like a
you probably
forge?
couldn't see them until some of it had oxidized and come off, and then when the oxidized comes off, you can still see hammer scars around. Yeah. And our conservator, a guy named Jay Blaine, who just passed away, but he's a great conservator, and he played with cannonballs from all across the South and colonial sites. It was always a mystery for him how they did that. It's still a mystery how they did that, but they're really good.
I guess, Ben, we got something to work on today.
All right. Yeah. Well, you're an archaeologist, you said? You mind if I ask you a question? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm already started. Yeah. I remember hearing a story about they kept finding these polished pieces of bone that they couldn't figure out what they were for. And then finally a leather worker goes, oh, that's for making folds in leather. I use that today still. Is there anything y'all found that it took some blacksmith to go, oh, I still use that tool? That's
I've been sitting here thinking about that. I have seen, well, once in a while we'll find a hammer. I never have, but in the sites I've worked. But periodically the hammers show up, and or at least the head of the hammer. And I can't think of them right off in the French sites. I work in French and Spanish colonial sites, so in most of those we don't find the anvils, and that's why I asked about them a while ago.
Well, that's an anvil was one of those tools that if you were walking away from a site and it's like we have to make a pretty quick exit, or we're just closing it out and we just pull out whatever you're assuming to say military site, you could leave half your hammers behind to lighten the load. All you needed was one hammer and a set of tongs, because you could make new hammers wherever you got, but if you didn't have an anvil,
it's also a lot harder to just drop one and lose it.
Right.
You realize when it's gone.
It falls out of the wagon, the next wagon's going to hit it. You're going to see it.
Know.
Well, at Presidio Los Dice, they closed the Presidio and put everybody back to Texas, and so they came back and got the cannons and the iron, because iron was scarce on the frontier. And so they came back later on and hauled all the iron back to Texas. And so I don't think I'm going to find an anvil. I'm still looking.
So Ben, asked you, have you ever found anything, off, that you say, oh, well, we didn't know what this was, and a blacksmith would say, oh, I can tell you what that is, because we still use it today. Just if you don't know, back when they were you would find blacksmith shops that were, like on a plantation or in a town where the blacksmith had, it had become not in vogue anymore, and they just shut the doors on the place and left it. And you go and you look at some of these old accounts where people sit there and they say, oh, well, yeah, I inherited a blacksmith shop, or I bought this blacksmith shop. I mean, they had one in Bossier, the Teagues, which was an old blacksmith shop, and when they sold it, you walk in, even as blacksmiths, you walk in and you see a pair of tongs hanging on the wall, and you get them off, and you go, "What the hell are these for?" You know, and that died with that smith, and he may have made that one pair for one job to hold. You know, they come out and they drop down and have something that sticks way up and over the curve because he was holding some sort of curved piece or some sort of something that had a hole in it or whatever. You know, and you just don't, you know. Even if they found something, it may be some blacksmith that go, "I don't know what that is."
That was for a specific job.
I don't want to be the video guy that knows more than anybody, but the Master Mirror find, there's several things that were in that tool set that they still argue what it was for, so that would go with what you're saying.
Yeah, you know, I mean, and you never, I mean, you know, I mean, it could be something as simple as because you don't think about it, because maybe there was a part that was thinner attached to it and it's gone. I mean, it could have been something as something for making and whittling a handle for a hammer or for an axe or for a tool. I mean, you know, if something's weathered off of it or eroded off, you know, and all you have is the handle. Yeah. You know, sometimes it's just, but yet there is. I've read that book several times, just because it's such a great read.
Yeah, it is.
A lot of it is still extremely identifiable, though. You know, we can look at these old woodcuts or old photos of blacksmith shops, and I know what the anvil is, I know where the vise is, I know what the forge is. You know, it's nice that our craft there's so much information and it's all stayed so. I mean, pretty much the same.
Yeah,
so much of the tradition stays.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can't blacksmith without an anvil. So in the early blacksmiths now, it may have been a stone anvil, but it was still an anvil. You know, I mean, you can only push the metal using a hammer. So so the tradition is still there. It's one of those, you know, it's one of those ancient crafts. I mean, it's, you know, carpentry, stonemason, blacksmith. I mean, all that kind of all ties together. I mean, that's, you know, I tell them when I do my school kid tours, you know, the first thing I say is if it wasn't for the blacksmiths, we'd all still be stuck in the Stone Age. You know, I mean, because they're the folks that brought us out of that and moved us forward. You know, even if it was that rough, crude piece of copper they found on the ground. I mean, that's not. A lot of people don't consider that blacksmithing because it's not iron. But to me, if it was heated and hammered, it's some sort of smithing.
The Egyptians used copper chisels.
Right. So, you know, it's been around for a long time.
Since we're talking good on blacksmiths so much, they refer to us as the king of the craftsmen, or we refer to us as the king of the craftsmen. I don't know who they is, but it's because the blacksmith can make everyone else's tools. If the woodworker needs a chisel, it goes to the blacksmith to make it. Yeah.
Stonemason needs a hammer and a chisel, or
go to the blacksmith.
Or the seamstress needs scissors and a needle. I mean, they're all made by the blacksmith. Yes, Richard.
Tell them about Jason's blower.
Jason's blower.
Yeah, I remember.
Oh, so.
Yeah, we had dimensions there.
So there's a folk school here in the United States. Well, there's several, but there's one called the John C. Campbell Folk School. It's in North Carolina. They have a world-class 12-student blacksmith shop. It is, I mean, when I say world-class, it is world-class. I've taken several classes there. Richard's taken several classes. Well, I say several. I think Richard's taken about 17 or so, 18 classes. I've taken about 12. I teach up there once a year usually. But we had a class that we took, and it was called Blacksmithing for Reenactors. And our instructor said, well, if we're going to be demonstrating on demonstration day, let's do a time period thing. So we'll go from very early blacksmithing, and we'll stage it all the way up. And Jason, the instructor, and I ran the Bellows Farmway forge. We squatted down, he dug a hole, and we put a blowpipe through it, and he had replicated. He didn't use goat bladders or whatever it was. He was supposed to use goat hides, but we used canvas, has wooden paddles on it, and you actually pump the bags with your hands. So we squatted down and we did that, and I was like, this is no way this is going to work. And once you get the rhythm down and you do it, it actually would heat the charcoal enough that he could heat up small links of metal and hammer it. So, and then from there we went up into doing leather bellows, and then from there into the hand crank blowers, and then into a electric blower. And so the method's all still the same. It's just how do you get that air from A to B has changed a little bit, but not much.
That was a pretty monotonous job too. So the people that would do that, they would sing songs or come up with beats to do it just to keep themselves entertained.
Anything else? Y'all have anything else? Well, if Ben and I can answer it. Or if not, we can make up a good answer.
What's the heaviest thing you've ever made, and what's the most interesting thing you think you've ever made? And they're probably both the same thing, but maybe not.
I don't know. Richard, I have to refer to Richard on that because Richard is one of our go-to. We worked on they filmed a TV show set in the Salem witch trials in Shreveport and called Salem. And we were hired to make a gob of stuff for that set. So we made, probably the biggest thing we've made were those planters, those 6-foot metal trellis things that came up and had all these curls on them, and they looked like a big, if you're familiar with the old school mannequins that they make, dress mannequins, that's what it looked like, except they were tall enough, they were 7 feet tall. So, and that would go for the heaviest one.
Yeah, the heaviest one. Yeah.
So that would probably be the biggest and interesting things we made. We made a couple big fireplace screens. That was another thing. We made chains for the larder. That was probably long. They were probably all 8 or 10 foot long and had big hooks on the ends of them, and they were all hand forged. And yeah. So what about you?
In Donaldsonville, there's a mausoleum, the Landry Mausoleum. It was one of the earlier things that the architect Dakin designed in the state. And on it, it had a big 8-foot tall gate that was made in the 1830s. And for some reason, they took it off the hinges and leaned it against the mausoleum. So it walked, it disappeared. So they commissioned me to remake it using modern techniques just because they didn't have the funds to pay for a hand-riveted 8-foot tall gate. But that was a lot of fun, and I just copied the original design from the 1830s.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Making it at the shop was fun. The thing had been open so long that somebody had gone in there and tried to bust open one of the caskets, and they pulled one of the graves halfway out, and it was one of those old cast iron viewing graves where it had a glass plate on top to where you could see inside of it. So I'm installing the gate, doing my best not to look at that casket. I don't need to see what's in there. Yeah. that was a lot of fun, and it was,
There might have been somebody looking back at it.
That's right. What you don't want to hear is this.
If the plate's not broken.
Yeah, somebody knocked it.
There are, for those of you who take a tour on Cane River and you go to Melrose Plantation, there are 2 8-foot grave markers hanging on the back of the house. They came from a cemetery down Cane River called Shallow Lake. It got pillaged years ago, and those grave markers are 8, 9 feet tall. And they sat on top of the mausoleums when you look up at them. But they're an amazing piece of iron. It's welded iron. And big things, heavy things.
So Ben mentioned making it, reproducing this gate and riveting it.
Not riveting it.
You did not rivet, right?
Yeah, I arc welded it together. I hand forged all of the elements and then welded it together. So for a while I was doing stair railings for a living. And what I tried to do as often as possible was convince them to pay me enough to forge as much of it, and then I would weld it together and install it. That way they could say, oh, I've got hand-forged elements or a hand-forged stair railing in my house. Most people, what they'll do is they'll buy cast iron pieces and kind of weld them in place, which is, everybody's got to make a living, and it's just not what I wanted to do personally.
So we'll almost come full circle back to the whole internet blacksmithing that you asked me earlier about internet. So when you rivet something together, especially when you get into a gate or a fence or a grate of any of that kind of stuff, and you have curled elements that are touching here and there, whatever, generally on a internet thing, they don't tell you that you need to be very mindful of where you're going to put your holes, because you have to be able to get your rivet tool inside so you can keep the domed head and then dome it on the other side. And then also, not only just to get your tool in, you have to be able to put it on the horn of the anvil, or you have to be able to have, wherever you're going to do it, to put it in there to put back pressure on it as you hammer. So it's one of those. And you have to, yeah, you have to have room to swing your hammer because it may be that the rivet, you know, you maybe have to drop the rivet in from the top instead of, you know, or however, because there may be another element, you know, there may be two curved pieces that come together with the rivet holding it together. So, you know, there's a lot of thinking ahead in blacksmithing that, again, that just not discussed usually when somebody's, you know, showing a video of it. Which is where I fall short. I tend to make A and B and go, crap.
Left a step out.
I needed to do A and C and then do B.
Yeah, I always thought of it as in like order of operations to get back to the math. You know, you know, I'll think through it and I know that I've got to be able to do this. So if I do all these other things before that cut me off from doing that, then I'm just out of luck. So for me, I'll really plan out what I'm doing. The plan doesn't always work, obviously, but I'll do my best to plan out.
All right, is that it?
Yeah.
We're getting the.
Yeah.
Is that what that means?
Yeah. Thank y'all a lot.
Sure, thank y'all. And if y'all want to brave the heat, you can come outside for a few minutes and watch us outside and ask more questions or.